Greetings, Earthlings, and welcome to the COM300 module on Logos. Our objectives for this module are to diagram key terms in an argument, to analyze and apply Toulmin's warranted structure model of argument. We're going to learn about Toulmin's vocabulary. Second, distinguish between the different types of argument and particularly their weaknesses. And third, identify important fallacies and match them to a variety of examples. Working vocabulary, as always, is on your plate for the quizzes. Let's talk about the primary terms, the vocabulary that Toulmin gives us. Toulmin didn't really think formal logic was very helpful in analyzing the way people talked. And so he wanted a way that would enable us to kind of pick apart arguments that weren't structured in a formal way. So data, I think we all kind of know, we see statistics and we see quotes and testimony from people. And then, we see examples and we see people telling stories and people using media clips. So, there's a lot of things that we sort of know of as data. But data is also grounds, which means that if the audience that you're speaking to believes a particular thing, then that can be the basis for claims because it's already there in their base of beliefs, right? So grounds can be things that the audience kind of assents to. That's sometimes why in speeches you don't see a lot of quotes or statistics, but you see some strong claims coming out of commonly held assumptions by the audience. So let's look at an example of, you have data that says that thousands of people are injured and many die as a result of side stream smoke. Smoke in the room when other people are smoking. And so that leads you to a claim that says, look, we should ban smoking in public, right? So that gives you the idea of a claim is that you want people to agree with you, you want people to change their behavior, you want people to go along with what you say and accept your argument, right? That's a claim. Well, when you ask yourself about a claim, the first thing you ask is, what's the qualifier? How broad is the claim, right? So, and in this instance, note that they're not saying we should ban all smoking or all tobacco. They're saying we should ban smoking in public. So they narrow it down to a very narrow focus because that's where the side stream smoke has the most effect, right? And is the least voluntary. Okay. So then the question becomes, well, how do you get from, okay, thousands of people are injured to let's ban smoking in public? What's the step there? What's the assumption made? And that assumption, that step, is what we call the warrant. That's often the assumption that goes unstated in many claims, right? So in this instance, when we look at an assumption for that argument, it would probably be something like states should regulate something that harms thousands of people, right? So that's kind of the assumption behind it. If thousands of people are injured and we should regulate it in public, ban it in public, then you're basically saying, you're assuming that that's something that a state should do, right? And then you would ask yourself, well, is there any backing for that warrant? And so, then you might say, well, does the state regulate other risks? And the answer might be, actually, yes. They do a lot of consumer product safety regulation, and they do lawnmowers and other kinds of things, right? So there is precedent for this in terms of backing for the warrant. So we got 5 terms there. Now the last one is whether or not there's a reservation of some kind. There's a rebuttal to it, and a reservation might be, well, unless the state legislature says that personal freedom to smoke is more important, right? In that case, the claim that we should ban smoking in public is not going to go very far, right? But empirically, you can see kind of how this argument played out, in Virginia at least. Let's talk about the primary types of arguments. Here's the deal on the types of arguments. We're revisiting this. The first time it was about how do you make arguments about a text? How do you do criticism? You go in and you look for examples, and then you pull those out and you make a larger claim, right? So, but this is, not only are you making arguments, but when you start reading through your speeches, you'll see that people are making all kinds of claims, and some of them have solid reasoning and some of them do not, right? And so, that's where you start to realize that you're not only using these argument types, but you're also critiquing them from a point of view of looking at the logos of the speech. So, argument by example. Are the examples typical? Okay, my friend tells me, don't go eat at that restaurant. We ate there 3 times. It was terrible. And I say, well, did you always eat there on a Friday night in the middle of a crush? Did you space out and go to different meals? And how typical was the experience? And 3, that's probably a sufficient number. But if you said I went there last week, that's only once. I probably wouldn't accept that. And then, are there any negative examples? So, did you have any good meals going to this restaurant? And do you account for those? Analogy. Are the key differences greater than the similarities? This is the really important thing. So the more similarities between the two things you're analogizing, the stronger your analogy is going to be, right? And that's also the more differences means that it's going to be a weaker analogy. And this restated, this is kind of the same thing as the structural similarities are probably more important than just kind of superficial similarities, right? One analogy might be a doctor diagnoses diseases like a detective investigates crimes. I can see certain, they're both licensed and maybe they're both looking for clues and something like that. But of course the investigator is using, very, very different techniques, and the doctor, has, way more education and more, background knowledge about specific symptoms and stuff. So, it's maybe not quite the strongest analogy. Argument from sign. In a speech, you'll often see, you'll make an argument that says, well, Martin Luther King uses a lot of anaphora, repeated phrases. I have a dream, let freedom ring. And that's kind of a sign of his background as a Southern preacher. And so I might ask, well, are there a sufficient number of signs? Is there enough examples of this repeated phrasing to think that that conveys the rhythm of a Southern preaching style? And is the association consistent? Every time I see that kind of rhythm pattern, am I seeing a Southern preacher style? And the answer is probably no. There are anaphoras that are not in that speaking style. But you still might say that there's a fairly strong association between that speaking style and using that kind of repetition. Argument from cause. Well, if we say human output of CO2 is resulting in significant climate change, then you're going to ask things like, is CO2 of sufficient strength to make that kind of impact on a very large ecosystem? And the answer seems to be, by a lot of scientific study, yes, we are having an impact. So there is of sufficient strength. Multiple causes is another issue that's been brought up quite a bit. Volcanoes and natural sources pump a lot of CO2 into the air. So the question is, do these other multiple causes dwarf or overwhelm the human impact? And the answer seems to be, in more recent times, no, that CO2 is of sufficient strength that these multiple causes don't overwhelm or even really compare to the impact that humans are having. Argument from principle. When you've got two principles, a major and a minor and a conclusion, and of course if you only have two of those parts, then that's an enthemy. You ask yourself, are both premises true? The example, the principle of equality before the law justifies legalizing gay marriage. All right, so then the question is, does the United States Constitution Amendment number 14 guarantee the citizens the equality before the law? That's a true premise. So are these gays and lesbians citizens of the United States? And the answer is yes, they're citizens by and large. And then the answer is, the conclusion is, therefore, should they be equal before the law in terms of marriage? And again, the Supreme Court answered, yes, that was valid reasoning, and the principles were both true. Authority. Support for the claim is the authority, quoting someone and so forth. 90% of climate scientists agree that human activity is increasing climate change. So the first question you ask is the credibility relevant to the claim? Is there something about the claim that is related to the person's expertise? Because if it's not, if he's a biochemist and he's talking about immigration policy, then that's not going to work out because it's not relevant to the claim. In this instance, climate scientists are the ones being surveyed, and so yes, much of their expertise is relevant to the claim. Are there additional sources? If you have one source that says something, that's kind of sketchy, depends a little bit on the credibility of the person, but if you have several sources or many sources that are all saying the same thing, then that's more credible. And are there any additional reasons behind, do we just have to believe you, or are there other reasons or other evidence to support the claim that's being made? So, talk about fallacies. Fallacies in general are errors in reasoning. You'll face a lot of them in your life. False claims, misleading arguments. And so it's good to kind of know a little bit about some of the generally expected ones. False analogy is when the similarities are not there. Things are too different. We don't teach safecracking in school, so we shouldn't teach communism. I mean, one's a crime, the other is a form of government that we would do well to understand. So there's really no comparison there. Hasty generalization on the basis of like one example. I went to the restaurant last week, don't go there ever again. That's a hasty generalization. Only one example or only one small illustration, and you're making a bad jump to a general conclusion. False cause. There may be alternate causes. There's two sort of related fallacies here. One is post hoc. So after that, therefore because of it, Hinckley watched violence on TV and then shot President Reagan. Well, did the one cause the other? Well, that turns out to be a fallacy in this case because he had other mental issues. It wasn't the TV violence. And then the other is the single cause fallacy, that one thing caused this whole complex thing, which is, again, there are examples of that, and that's a bad analogy. Appeals to, ad hominem, appeals to the man, to the person. When you attack the person, then instead of responding to the argument, you just go straight for the person. You can't talk to me because your grades were not very good in college either, right? So instead of addressing the argument, you go and attack the person. Ad populum, to the people. Everyone else is doing it. I'm sorry, officer, everyone else was going 75, right? As you can see, that's a fallacy. Just because a whole bunch of people believed slavery was right, didn't mean it was right. Ad verecundium, appeal to authority, to usually an unqualified or potentially biased, unidentified. So, climate change is bogus. There's lots of studies that disprove it. That's very general, vague, and who are they done by? The tobacco industry is successfully proven that smoking cigarettes is safe, and we know why that was the case back in the last century. All right, so appeal to tradition, last one, is arguing a policy is justified because we've always done it that way. We've always had slavery, so that's the way we should keep it, right? Or in a more, sort of recent thing, our mascot has always been Gunston. Why should we change to the Patriot? right? And so that change actually happened, right? Okay. Three others: equivocation, using an ambiguous word, equivocating on it. So when you go to the grocery store, you buy light Pringles. And what does that mean? Are you really getting a healthier snack? They're being somewhat deceptive in terms of what they say is light. Begging the question when the claim is actually a restatement of the claim. Right? You don't offer any evidence of the claim, you just restate it. So it's begging the question, is circular reasoning. The soul is immortal because it lives forever. Right? And then a non sequitur, just does not follow. A refutation that it just has no relevance or meaning. So don't go see a dentist. You went to see a doctor last week. Right? It's like, huh? That's non sequitur. It does not follow. Finally, find and post an advertisement link that contains a fallacy or a weak argument. Why is it a weak argument? How could it be made stronger? Do you agree with other posts? So, live long and prosper. Could you beam me up, please? Right. I'll wait. Have a great day.